Welcome back to the Blackletter podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening.
Hi, this is Tom Dunlap, your host, back with you on the Blackletter podcast. This week with me, once again, I've got my friend and Chief Counsel at the FAA, happy, smiling Marc Nichols. And this week, he's going to bring us one of his problems. He's going to tell us about a challenge, whether it's a current problem, past problem, and how he overcame that. And, we'll all walk away having learned something more, which is why I love this show. Marc, I'm not going to lay into you. I'm going to open up the floor. I know you've thought about this. So of all of the things in life, what challenge do you think is particularly interesting or salient, or what would you like to share today? This is the sharing time. It's like romper.
Well, I'm gonna raise a couple. One is I think something that everybody will relate to, which is dealing with the aftermath of COVID. As a senior executive, as a manager, where you got employees who don't want to come back to work, or at least into the office.
May not be the first person that said that in the
yes,
last 3 months, every day of the week. I've heard that from. I have a friend at the EU in Europe, and he's like, "It's just me and 6 people in the building. And we
yes,
just get the junior people to come in. They just won't."
but
So
I think
love it.
part of this for me though is the challenge because as a federal employee, we have lots of workspace, as you can imagine, in Washington D.C. The FAA has 2 buildings on Independence Avenue across the street from each other that are hardly occupied. What is our responsibility to the American public to make great use of taxpayer money that went into securing these facilities, and making sure that we're getting the best use out of them on behalf of the American people, or we are deciding that we maybe need to do something else with those facilities. And so, part of this for me is looking at what our responsibilities are to the taxpayers and making sure that we're living up to that responsibility. Certainly, it is to our employees. I'm in the process of hiring, hopefully, about 100 new employees over the next 2 to 3 years. Most of them are going to be young attorneys coming into the federal government for the first time, or at least into the FAA for the first time. There is a significant learning curve that needs to happen, because when you come into the FAA, you learn that there's not a lot of things that are intuitive. You have to be around, you have to learn it from others, you have to collaborate more. And if you don't, then it really slows down the process. And in our line of work, slowing down the process means maybe slowing down safety, and that puts everybody at risk. And we don't want to do that ever. So we have to kind of walk this very fine line. When during the pandemic, none of the air traffic controllers, of which we have a substantial number, I say about 15, 20,000 employees at the FAA are air traffic controllers. They could not work from home. They had to actually work in the air traffic control towers during the pandemic. And so when I was trying to decide what the legal team's policy was going to be for coming back to work, I had it in the back of my head, what would I tell these air traffic controllers who had to go in every single day, despite and face down the challenges of a deadly pandemic, all in the interest of serving our taxpayers and ensuring that they had safe passage if they were flying around the country, because there were people who were flying around the country because they had to. I tried to make sure that I was trying to be fair both to the larger picture about what was going on, but to those younger employees who need to have some FaceTime with me or other senior leaders who actually learn around the proverbial water cooler what's going on. and then decide, oh, I really would like to kind of get involved in that, because we're not having those kinds of conversations on Zoom or Teams meetings. We're not sitting around after meetings and having a discussion about maybe some things that didn't come up during that meeting that, upon further reflection, now we're starting to have, that's now starting to come out. And those young people aren't sitting around learning from, these older, more experienced attorneys in terms of how to interact, how to manage, how to suss out what their clients are really looking for, and how to address those things. So, so you have both of those things. So that's one example. The second, I was at
So, Mark,
Rolls.
to ask on
Yeah.
that, did you ever tell when somebody says, "Hey, I just don't want to come in," especially the younger people? We found that. Do you just say, "Look, this is the FAA. That doesn't fly here."
Yeah, well, I could have said that, but no, with the way I
No,
try to,
it's a
I
horrible joke. I'm sorry.
no,
Did
no,
you
hey,
get
it's probably true, but but the way I tried to couch it, so I made a rule that non-managers had to come in 2 days a week, managers had to come in 3 days a week, and you would have thought that I had made a slur about somebody's mother, but with the anger that was.
out? Yeah. How did that work out?
But ultimately, I tried to be very forthcoming about why I thought it was, at the end of the day, going to be better. If you had asked me before the pandemic whether I thought teleworking was good, from a productivity standpoint, et cetera, you know, I- most people in this country would have probably said no, because we're not in Silicon Valley, which has been pioneering on teleworking for a very long time. But that's
Right.
not been the experience of the rest of the country. I think what the pandemic showed is that, yes, we can make it work, and we can make it work relatively well, but there are still gaps in terms of how we need to work and collaborate and get the most efficient and effective ness out of our employees and our work experience. And as managers, we have responsibilities to meet those too, and to bring them out. And you can't do that solely from a Zoom meeting.
We found that our older people wanted to be in the office, the people who were over 45, for example, and the younger people after this was kind of over and were like, we always had an open office. We're a government contractor as a law firm, all this stuff. But the younger people were the ones that we have the biggest challenge with. They're so used to it. It was so easy for them and for most of our middle-aged people to do this. Did you find that kind of split, or was it more responsibility split, or what? How did you find that?
Well, so a lot of your viewers may not, or listeners may not realize, but the FAA has almost, I'd say, 60 to 70% of its workforce is unionized,
Oh,
um,
okay.
in- including most of the lawyers in my office are
Wait,
also
you're in
unionized.
the union? What union
Yes.
is that? What is that union?
So we have two different unions, NATCA and ASME. And so, you have, a different set of concerns because they have a collective bargaining agreement, and you have to negotiate, and one of the things I learned coming to the FAA, which is just bizarre, is that we have multiple different types of unions who will have different collective bargaining agreements with various departments within the FAA. So it's not like one collective FAA collective bargaining agreement that we're dealing with. We've got, like, I don't know, like 13, 15 different collective bargaining agreements that we have to deal with. And so each one, obviously has to be given their due respect, but each manager also needs to try and figure out what's in the best interest, not just for the employees and the workers, which of course is always an important element, but you also have to try and figure out what's in the best interest of the government and the taxpayers and the service that you're supposed to be providing in the manner in which you're supposed to be providing it. It's a challenge.
Right. Well, because you're holding people's lives in your hand. I mean, arguably, aviation is I think it's one of the safest things in the country. I'm a pilot. I tell people you're much higher chance of dying on the Beltway, as you and I both know, than dying in a commercial aircraft crash. But it's also one of the things people are most afraid of. And when there is an accident, it's the biggest, you know, everybody dies. What is it? These jets glide like pianos. So
Yeah.
you're always like, put your seatbelt on, I was like, you're gonna die if the plane falls out of the sky. It's just
Uh,
there's
I,
no.
I work for the aviation industry, aerospace industry. I love aircraft, but even I have a healthy, let's say, respect for what an aircraft is, the skill of pilots. And, you're in these multi-ton cylindrical tubes flying through the air at 500, 600 miles an hour. It needs to be given its due respect. And one of the things I have learned, which I knew coming into the agency, but it's been even better to learn once I got here, is just how much safety drives our decision making. It may not be me on that flight, but maybe I'm sending Daniel somewhere. It may not be me on that flight, but maybe I'm sending my friend Tom somewhere. It may not be me on that flight, but maybe it's my friend's mother that's on that flight. And to a person that I have met here at the FAA, there isn't a single person who doesn't take seriously the responsibility that we have to every single individual. We may not always get it 100% right. We're human beings, but it won't be for lack of trying.
Well, so what I love, Mark, and you probably know this, I've done a fair amount of work in aviation outside of the country, and every other country views the FAA as the gold standard. So most countries, if you meet the FAA standard, you automatically meet their standards when it comes to aircraft manufacturing and maintenance and things like that. And I just think it's an amazing thing to give credit to the agency and what you guys do. So set that aside. So back to you. Tell me about your problems. So COVID was one, and we talked about how you resolved that. So you said you had something else.
So one of the things that when I was at Rolls Royce, and I'm not telling you anything that isn't public, Rolls Royce was embroiled in a bribery scandal that got all sorts of public attention, and ended up costing the company a massive amount of money in fines and things. But during that process, I was tasked with leading Rolls Royce's response to it in the U.S. And in Brazil, which was part of my jurisdiction when I was at Rolls Royce. And I was working with a wonderful team that was being overarchingly led, by some wonderful attorneys in England, where Rolls Royce was based. One of the things that you learn is the importance of reputation. I forget who the character was, but somebody says, where do I go to get my reputation back? I always try to teach young people that you know part of what you do, part of who you are, it usually comes long before you entered the room. The more you're out in the public space, the more that will precede you when you get into the public room, and you have to decide what type of reputation, what you want to be said about you when it gets there long before you. Now, you have the opportunity maybe to change minds once people do meet you, but it makes life a hell of a lot easier if the reputation that you have when you entered the room is an outstanding one. Part of that challenge was trying to rehabilitate Rolls Royce's reputation after this bribery scandal, and all the changes that we had to make in terms of the rules that we had, the policies that needed to be changed, our relationship with the government. As now sitting on the other side of that table, let me just counsel everyone is that there is nothing better than for you to just be upfront and truly transparent with the government, because we understand humans are by their nature failed individuals. You will have failure. We're not expecting perfection. We're trying to ensure that you recognize the shortcomings of what has happened and you're trying to deal with them. We may have to respond as a result, but the response won't be nearly as severe as if we have to go and do it ourselves, or we don't feel like you and your client are taking the matter to heart and trying to really truly solve the root problem. And that's ultimately what we're looking for.
Over the last 20 years dealing with FAA enforcement matters, my experience, and it's changed from manager of the FAA to manager of the FAA's legal team. but I've seen it where the FAA attorneys are like, look, if I truly believe you're cooperating, if you're not lying to me, we've always worked something out that makes sense, like remedial training or something like that. They're not going to give you a 91.3 reckless violation if you work with them. So as the head of this organization now and doing that, it sounds like you're kind of a similar mind. If you lie to them, they're going to bust you as hard as they can, of course, and that makes sense. But I have a slightly loaded question in a different area, and you're like, "Uh-oh, Tom, Jesus, I know you. You're giving me a hard
I
question."
cannot, I
So
cannot dismiss that case against you, Tom. Sorry.
yes, you cannot. So I'm going to ask it, and like I said, we can cut it. But if you need to lead from the front as the head of an organization, and if the government wants the people who interact with it to be honest with it, and looking back at the prior administration, I'm not talking about your prior, but the prior administration generally, there's a lot of stuff in the news. I'm not opining on it. Um, Not a huge fan of the prior administration personally. I'm pretty clear about that. But there's a lot of stuff in the news. How do you think that affects people's view of the government long term and in dealing with any aspect of the government if there are issues of, hey, somebody in the government at the top of the government did something wrong? I mean, how does that affect things for you? Does it affect things for you? I'm just curious more than anything
Yeah,
else. That's
that's a
not
great,
fair.
it's a great question. No, and I've been asked this before, so I will
Oh,
sort of give you a slight, a different take on what I normally say. So, as a lawyer, we call it the practice of law, right? And, people sometimes expect you to come in and you have your set talking points or your set pieces or your set template form or what have you. But at some point, something needs to change in the document, in the courtroom,
right.
in the boardroom, what have you. Which is why it's called the practice of law. Sometimes you'll get it right, and you'll hit it right on the nose, and sometimes you won't. By comparison, I often say, this experiment that the founders gave us is the practice of civic engagement, because in a lot of ways, we don't get it right on the first try, or the second, or the third, or the fourth,
For the
but
48th, 49th.
but the genius of the Constitution is it says, in order to strive for a more perfect union. And so that's why it's the practice of civic engagement. And we all owe it as citizens to continue that practice. And for some of us, we will practice a lot more because of where we sit. My role in the government means I practice it a bit more every day. Than maybe somebody in the middle of Texas or Minnesota or what have you. But we all have a responsibility to practice, whether it's by voting, whether it's by encouraging. Maybe it's also by writing a letter that you oppose something, or getting involved in your school board contest, or what have you. We all owe some responsibility to make sure that if this country is to become what we hope it to be, it relies on every single one of its citizens doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is taking part in our government to help it form a more perfect union, whatever that means in our mind's eye that it should be. And coming back full circle to where we started this conversation, that's what it was about for me, and why I decided to take this job is because this was yet one more example of me trying to engage in the practice of civic engagement, just from, perhaps a slightly higher viewpoint.
I love it that you pulled everything back to the Constitution and striving. I've never even really personally thought about striving for a more perfect union. That's fantastic. So, Mark, next week I'm going to ask you for pieces of advice. And I feel like we've gotten a lot of advice from you. Our listeners certainly have. And things have changed for you just in the last year about how you view the world, which is fantastic. Even us old folks, right, over 50, we can have things that change. So, next week I'll ask you to share a couple pieces of advice, two or three things, or one or six, whatever it is, some number of things with our listeners. And listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Blackletter Podcast with Marc Nichols, Chief Counsel, Federal Aviation Administration. We'll be back with you and Marc next week to talk about his closing pieces of advice, his life and business advice for you throughout his career, how it shaped him, and what you can do. Download us wherever you get your podcasts. I'll remind you, Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, YouTube. We'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.